Braving the snow. I say, hey, you haven't had an Indiana spring unless it snows, right? I mean, and I apologize if you're trying to cultivate fruit trees or something that doesn't like this. But here we are. Let's review. This is session 3 out of 4 for Francis Schaeffer. In our first session, we traced Schaeffer's life from his birth in 1912 through his multinational trip the summer of 1947. Highlights from the first session include his conversion story when he's 18 years old, his preparation for ministry, his introduction and marriage to Edith, and his early career as a pastor for 10 years before the beginnings of an international ministry. We noted that he's, from a young age, an intellectual. He likes to think deeply. He likes to read deep thinkers. He loves truth, goodness, and beauty, and so there's this side of him that loves art and music and its correspondence to philosophy and theology. And that's going to be a big theme in his life and ministry. We also noted that he's a separatist working in separatist institutions. So we talked a little bit about his denomination, his church, and the seminary that he was part of in that first session. In the second session, we traced Schaeffer's life from his exploratory tour of Europe in 1947 on the behalf of the denomination, and through the founding of L'Abri, which is French for the shelter. It's going to be the biggest part of their life's work there in Switzerland, age 43. Highlights from the second session include the Schaeffer's decision to become missionaries, moving to Switzerland, his conversation with Karl Barth, his growing concern about the tone of his denomination being rather combative and difficult, his faith crisis, and as he describes it, a complete rethink going back to the beginning of his faith to examine its claims to see if he still believed it. And then the split in his denomination, which leads to their decision to go out on their own and found L'Abri as a faith mission separate from the original sending agency that they had been with. And we talked about that last week and learning a little bit about those decisions, how those came about. So if you're interested, these are on the live stream area of our website. You can go back and look at the previous sessions. To review L'Abri a little bit, this work is a conglomerate of hospitality. Their home is open to whomever wants to show up. Bible classes, organized Bible classes, children's ministry, fellowship, and the Schaeffers traveling around Europe and even the United States, continuing to foster their wide network of friends. Continually, we'll say anybody can come up who wants honest answers for honest questions. These are the type of people that we're looking for that can come in. And if you're searching, if you're interested in discovering more about Christianity, about religion, or if you just have problems in general, we have a shelter up on the mountain for you. Come and be. Early visitors to L'Abri were from the nearby school, but now that their daughter Priscilla was enrolled in college, she starts bringing home friends. And we also talked a little bit briefly last week about how the early years, the first 5 years from 1955 to 1960, are extremely tight financially. So they are constantly praying for money. Their diet is very meager. They have worn through all of their wedding presents, so there's holes in the sheets, and you can just imagine kind of a meager existence. It's cold a lot of the time in Switzerland, and they have to be very careful about controlling the fuel for the fireplaces. And so the people who would visit there said it's just constantly cold. And but things start to open up a little bit as it becomes more and more well known. Word spreads and people keep coming. Last week I showed you a picture of the chalet, and the biographer says the chalet is kind of like its own character in the story. So if you talk to people who have been to L'Abri, they talk about how important the house is, how important its setting is. Speaking of, look at that view. I don't know what you look out when you look out your window, what you see when you look out your window. We don't see that here in Indiana. We see something else. But just imagine if you, to go along with the name, the shelter, if you were troubled with your faith and with your religion, and you had doubt, what kind of it'd be compelling to listen to somebody like Francis and Edith Schaeffer talking about truth, goodness, and beauty when you're surrounded with that kind of beauty. And their aesthetic wasn't only for the outdoors, it was for the indoors too. So they liked to have fresh cut flowers and beauty in the house as they could afford it. So pretty stunning. Here's a view from one of the rooms. So pretty good retreat atmosphere. So I'm going to just continue to give you more quotes from witnesses who can continue to give us a picture of what this is like and what Mr. Schaeffer himself was like. When Mr. Schaeffer would talk to you, there was nothing else in the world that was going on. He was totally focused on you and what you were talking about and was very involved, very interested. It wouldn't matter who the person was. It could be from the most simple person to the most intellectual. That focused and interest and involvement was the same. I saw it time and time again. I experienced it myself, and it wasn't anything false. He was really interested in people, and it was something that was very, very striking. I'd never seen that degree of concentration and having that kind of attention, I don't think, with anybody else. That enormous personality he had, it would all be focused on you, and he never forgot anything that you told him. For instance, he went way back with my family. He would remember all the little details of the family, my brother, my sister, various things over the years that he had learned. It was part, obviously, of that phenomenal memory he had for everything, but it was his memory for these personal details that made his talking with people enormously effective. So just a couple of things to draw out from this quote. One is the amount of care that he took with people. We'll continue to say that Francis Schaeffer is first and foremost a pastor before all else. He is a pastor. And this amount of desire to care for people one-on-one was always the vision. And they never dreamed that it would become as big as it did. And the second thing is that memory is a function of intelligence. And so he's smart, he remembers things, but it's also a function of care. He cares to remember these details about folks. And if any of you have known somebody who's like this, who just seems to remember things, it really draws you into relationship, doesn't it? That they are paying attention to the details. Maybe they were praying about those details. How do they remember those details? So try not to be too hard on the rest of us normal folks who live in the normal world of forgetfulness and the loss of detail. But it is remarkable when you do come across somebody who cares and can remember. This is a quotation from the first session. We talked about the Rookmakers, and this is from Mrs. Rookmaker, how important the Schaeffers were to her. She says this: "I didn't like the church I was in. It was very strict. So we wrote the Schaeffers. That was the first time that we went to Humo in Switzerland. We were there for 3 weeks, and that meant a lot to us for all our lives. It's very strange. You become a Christian and you go to church and you don't like it. Then you go to Switzerland and Dr. Schaeffer explains all these things, all my questions. Then you go back, you hear the same things in your own church. It seems that I needed to be with the Schaeffers." L'Abri had just started. We were almost the first people who came to Humos. Because there were many students coming then, that made a big impression on us. What I remember most was that the Schaeffers prayed actually much more than the Dutch churches, and the prayers were answered. That you see the prayers answered helps a lot, I think, in your belief. I think Mrs. Schaeffer is a wonderful woman. I learned a lot from her. I came from a non-Christian background. She took time to teach me. She taught me about praying because I didn't know very much. I'm very grateful for that. From that time on, we were friends, and always I had regular contact. Dr. Schaeffer preached about prayer, I think especially for me to understand it. Without the Schaeffers, I wouldn't be here, a Christian now, I think. And this is testimony not only of, that's important because it's the Rookmakers, but it's also important because it is what thousands of people would come to say. So it's representative testimony of a pattern that these people pray. They pray deeply, they pray a lot. They were running the mission in such a way that they were seeing their prayers answered. and it made a deep impression. So this, and with all the like intellectual stuff, and I'm even going to throw some heavier intellectual stuff at you tonight. Hopefully you got coffee and some cookies, and also don't care too much if it just flows by. That's okay. But for all of that, you have to remember this aspect of deeply personal relationship and a devotional and prayer life that matched the intellectual firepower, if you will. There was not a dichotomy in this family.
Who was Anki Rookmacher?
Anki Rookmacher is the wife of Hans. Thank you. I couldn't come up with his name. Wife?
What was the answer?
She's the wife of Hans Rookmacher. So remember in the first session we were talking about Hans Rookmacher. This is his wife, Anki. Thank you, and thanks for bringing the name up for me. I couldn't pull it up. I'm doing pretty good with Mr. and Mrs. at this point. So besides the local work at their house, he's also expanding his connections in Milan, Italy especially, and in England. He's been invited to lecture at Oxford and Cambridge, and there will eventually become a long-term L'Abri branch in England that he was instrumental in establishing relationships there. His daughter Susan and her husband will be important to that work later. The summers are especially busy, and you can imagine why. Students are on summer break. They have more time to travel. In the summer of 1959, this is only 4 years in, they had 185 guests from 16 different nationalities. So a couple of things to notice. One, there's a lot of visitors, but two, they're coming from all over the place. This isn't just all Americans or all English, they're just from all over the world. So the global kind of networking that's going to happen has to do with that aspect. Part of that has to do with the fact that they're living in Switzerland, where there are places where tourists come. We talked a little about that last week. But they're also dealing with schools that have a lot of people from all over the world in these universities in Europe that are traveling. So here's a list of those nationalities: Argentinian, Dutch, Swiss, American, South African, English, Malaysian, French, Greek, Italian, El Salvadoran, New Zealander, Australian, Belgian, Hungarian, German, and missionaries from Japan, India, Africa, Belgium, and the Congo. So I think we've pretty much covered all the continents where people live, except for Antarctica. I do think a few scientists live there, but you get my idea. I mean, it's literally a global convergence. Then a tip from a friend leads to a Time article entitled Mission to Intellectuals. So with all of their desire to not have any official publication, and they kept that up, besides word of mouth, a major periodical featured them, and the word was out that there are interesting people up on the mountain in Switzerland. Here's a description of the article. The article characterized the Schaeffer's chalet as the venue of one of the most unusual missions in the Western world. Describing Fran as sandy-haired and sad-faced, the article briefly told the history of L'Abri from the expulsion from Champéry. It sketched what was happening when the journalist visited. And these are the journalist's words. The 20-odd guests this week include an Oxford Don, an engineer from El Salvador, a ballet dancer, and an opera singer. The one thing they have in common is that they are intellectuals, and the European intellectual is the single object of the Schaeffer's mission in the mountains. And biographer Colin Duritz says that takes the next 16 years as a distinct phase in Schaeffer's career. So right now we are talking about the phase that goes from 1960 to 1976. In 77 until his death, he enters into a very different phase of the career. That's what we'll take on next week. So this week I'm primarily focused on this. And my goal is to just give you some characterizations of what it was like, but tonight I'll also show you a film that is in his series, How Then Shall We Live? It's a 10-part series, because this is the first time that I've ever had access to like film evidence of these people, and I think that it is tremendously helpful for you to get an idea of what he sounds like, how they put these things together. The film series How Then Shall We Live occurs in 10 parts. You can find all of this for free on YouTube if you search Francis Schaeffer How Then Shall We Live, and you can watch all 10. And he takes the timeline from ancient Rome all the way up to the modern times, and it kind of builds on itself. So if you don't understand some things tonight, realize I'm going to plop you in on session 7. There were 6 before. You guys can go back and do some homework and watch these. But this one is where he's trying to trace a little bit of the intellectual history into the 20th century and describe how we got where we are. And then in the 8th one, he's going to tackle art and music. So probably next week, I'd like to show you the 8th one where he tackles art and music, because he's trying to show that worldview influences all of the areas of study. They're not all of these just isolated things. Art and science, and they're integrated according to worldview and the dominant philosophy of the age. And so he's going to trace themes in each of those major categories so that you can see really where we are, explaining where we are. And that was one of the things that was so powerfully compelling to people who came to visit them, because they were on a search for meaning in a century that had lost meaning. Now, what does that mean? Think about the trajectory of thought, and I'm just briefly trace this from the turn of the 19th century and into the 20th, right? Right around the turn of the 20th century, everyone had all this high optimism that we will continue to evolve and progress, and with our industry and our technology and our ideas and science, we will be able to establish the greatest societies that the world has ever seen. So there's a tremendous high point of optimism globally, particularly intellectually, around the turn of the 20th century. Now, what happens is that optimism takes like a 1-2 punch, right? In the first half of the 20th century. What's the 1-2 punch to the optimism of the turn of the 20th century? Say it together. World War I and World War II. And so can you imagine what it's like to experience global conflict like that, with the body counts as high as they are, not only with service personnel, but with civilians, right? And imagine the problem. Like, okay, we're going to still hear optimism in the way we describe World War I, the war to end all wars. It's an optimistic statement, isn't it? And then a generation later to be going through that all over again, but worse. We're more efficient even than before in killing people. And then the bomb, right? And that does a number on the intellectual world, but that isn't the only place that it does a number on. It does a number on everyone. You come back after experiencing the trenches, the meaninglessness, the absurdity of that, and try to put your life together, you can see how that optimism comes down into a pessimism. And Schaeffer will continue to talk about how the modern man has come down underneath this line of despair. And there's an embrace of despair as the truth that is the most noble, and an embrace of the absurd as the most noble. And so people that are growing up and coming to age in the 60s and the 70s, they're on a quest for meaning, aren't they? And they're trying all these things out. Where is meaning? Can we find meaning? And Schaeffer's like, I got some answers for you. First of all, I can tell you how you got to that question. But secondly, I can give you a compelling way to view history and art and music and in a way that shows Christianity as not only a viable option, but the option.
Amen.
And people found it tremendously compelling. Tremendously compelling. So, just some background on that. and you do need to get a taste of this. So let me see how much I have here before I get to my video. Schaeffer is almost alone in this. He is uniquely gifted and poised to give analysis from an evangelical worldview of the massive intellectual, political, and cultural upheaval of the 1960s and 1970s. Now, we're going to continue to say this. He is not an academic with a PhD in art history. He is trained as a pastor. And one of the ways he is able to do this to the masses is because he is accessible to the masses and he knows how to speak the language of the masses. And so, yeah, I'm not going to say much more on that. I'll let him speak for himself in a second here. We're also going to notice that he goes from one-on-one conversations to cassette tape recordings of those conversations to lectures, which then get turned into books. And he's very hesitant of each change. He's paying very close attention to youth culture. He's listening to music. He's watching movies. He's studying it. But he's, like I just said, he's reluctant with each phase of expansion. What I mean there by expansion is he doesn't want anybody recording the stuff. He doesn't want to publish books. He doesn't want to do this. Every time they ask him to do more, he's like, I'm not so sure. So there's a reluctancy related to that pastoral concern, that connection that he wants to have with each person. When I was working, this is actually pretty humorous. When I was working at L'Abri in the early days, I really expected to be talking one-to-one. I never even intended to make tapes. And the tape program just opened up. It's rather ironic now. Somebody sent us a tape recorder, and I said, I'll never use it. It'll kill the spontaneity of the conversation, which is a real concern. The tape recorder must have been in our office for at least 6 months. Then, one Saturday night, down in Les Mélizés, sorry if I'm butchering French. I took Spanish, not French, so you guys can help me with the pronunciations. Down in the living room, and we had a really bang-up conversation going with some Smith College girls. One of our workers came up and said to Edith, "It's a shame this isn't being recorded. It'll be lost. Now, if you'll just make a lot of noise serving tea, I'll hide the microphone in the flowers." I noticed some kind of confusion and wondered what was going on. Then when I found out later that the conversation had been recorded, I must say I was furious. I felt this was unfair to those girls. They thought it was a private conversation. Then, to my amazement, every one of the girls was delighted and bought copies of the tape to take home, not only for themselves, but for their friends. This opened the tape program. It was as simple as that. By 1968, they had over 1,000 hours of recorded content. And it changed the L'Abri experience a little bit. So you could come and not only interact with the Schaeffers, but you could go to the content library and look at the list of what was available, and you could pick according to what your topics of interest were, what your questions were, or whatever they told you to go listen to, you could go and listen to. So even the resident people that were staying there, they really started to listen to a lot of these tapes. This audio library included Bible study, theology, philosophy, cultural analysis, and it's really I almost printed up the list of resources so you can see what the topics were to pick from. It's a pretty good list. He goes on a speaking tour, several speaking tours in the U.S. The one in 1965 includes a lecture series at Wheaton that's important. When Francis August Schaeffer first burst onto the American evangelical scene in the mid-1960s, the reaction within that community was similar to the reaction of Americans to the appearance of Sputnik streaking across the autumn sky. No one had ever seen anything like it before, and it was difficult to discern what it all meant. There was great concern over his long hair, and why did he wear those funny knickers, knee socks, and hiking shoes? All in all, evangelical Protestants were, for the most part, at a complete loss. Who is this guy? When Schaeffer lectured at Wheaton College and frequently referred to the existentialist films of Ingmar Bergman and Federico Fellini, the students were in the midst of fighting with the administration for the right to show films like Bambi and Herbie the Love Bug on campus. Here's Schaeffer. As I lectured in many places, in Britain, in Germany, and the USA, I gradually developed a basic lecture called Speaking Historic Christianity into the 20th Century World. When I gave it at Wheaton College, Illinois, they asked if they could put it out as a small Xeroxed book. I said, well, only for your students because I don't want published books. When I saw that, however, and read it over, I realized I had a responsibility to publish. It became the book, The God Who Is There. So these speaking tours are all over the place. West Coast, East Coast. In the West Coast, he's particularly interested in hippie culture. He's interested in figuring out what's going on with rock and roll culture, with drug culture. What are people looking for in this quest for meaning? And actually, people talked about his long hair and goatee and his interesting clothes helped him relate to people who had long hair and interesting clothes. So particularly on the West Coast. And then the East Coast, some of the brightest minds in the nation show up to hear Schaeffer. Look at this. It's hard to imagine Harvard, Yale, Oxford, or Cambridge officially inviting him to lecture at that time. But it's equally difficult to envision an official academic speaker drawing and holding captive the large and intelligent audiences that Schaeffer attracted. His quirky attire and high register voice, if anything, deepened the interest. And his easy knowledge of Bob Dylan, Salvador Dali, and Federico Fellini spoke the language of Harvard students. The final lecture at Harvard found Lowell Lecture Hall jammed with people sitting on the floor, in the aisles, and standing in the back after all the downstairs seats were full. Os Guinness reported that one could feel almost an electric charge in the air. The interest was so keen. And at the conclusion of the lecture, The God Who Is There was a burst of applause that lasted 10 minutes, although many of the audience were agnostics or atheists. And this is before he's super famous. This is before the films. This is before the film tours. This is what it is. Here it is. I think that is the end of that. So now I'm going to transition you to the video. I'm going to check the time. We're doing great on time. And if you're on the live stream and you would prefer to watch this on YouTube because your quality might be better, then you can try that out. Either way.
The history of the non-Christian philosophers up until the 18th century went like this. Here is a circle which stands for what the unified and true knowledge of the universe is. Then the next man would say, no, and cross out the circle. But he then would say, here is the circle. And the next man would say, no, and cross out that circle. Then he would make his circle. And the next man would cross it out and make his circle. This continued through the centuries. They never found the circle, but they optimistically believed someone would, beginning only from man himself and on the basis of man's reasoning alone. Then the endless row of circles through the centuries and the crossing out was broken. And a drastic shift came because the humanistic ideal had failed. Humanistic man gave up his optimism for pessimism. He gave up the hope of a unified answer. And this makes modern man who he is. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, philosopher from Geneva, he lived in the 18th century. He thought primitive man, the noble savage, to be superior to civilized man. He felt that the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, the arts and the sciences, caused man to lose more than he gained. Rousseau saw the constraints of civilization as evils.
L'homme est né libre, et cependant, partout il est dans les fers.
Man was born free, but everywhere he is in chains. He demanded not just freedom from God or the Bible, but freedom from any kind of restraint. Freedom from culture, freedom from authority, absolute freedom for the individual, with the individual at the center of the universe. When applied to the individual, his concept led to the bohemian ideal, where the hero was the man who fought all standards and all values and all restraints of society. When Rousseau applied his concept of autonomous freedom to society, his concept would not function. Whosoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. Rousseau wrote this in 1762. This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. In other words, tyranny. A tyranny that carried his position to its logical conclusion in the reign of terror of the French Revolution. Robespierre, the king of the terror, genuinely saw himself putting Rousseau's ideas into practice. Paul Gauguin was a follower of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his hunt for total freedom, he deserted his family. He went to Tahiti, hoping to find there the noble savage. There he found the ideal of the noble savage to be an illusion. As he worked on this painting, he also wrote about it. He called it a philosophical work comparable to the gospel. But what a gospel! Gauguin himself said,
"Close to the death of an old woman, a strange, stupid bird concludes. Whence? What? Whither? O sorrow, thou art my master. Fate, how cruel thou art, and always vanquished. I revolt."
what he found in Tahiti was death and cruelty. The man is good by nature, as Rousseau claimed, is no more true a primitive man than a civilized man. When Gauguin finished this painting, he tried to commit suicide, but he did not succeed. There was one man who well understood the logical conclusion of the deification of nature, the Marquis de Sade. If nature is all, then what is right, and nothing more can be said. As nature has made us, the man, the strongest we can do with her, the woman, whatever we please. The inevitable result was his cruelty to women. Thus, there was no basis for either morals or law. Let me dwell for a moment on the Dutch Reformation painters, who so rejoicingly painted the simple things of life. They knew that nature was created by a personal and a good God. But they also knew, because of the fall, man's revolt against God, that nature as it is now is abnormal. That is a very different thing than taking nature as it is now and making it the measure of goodness. Because when this is done, there is no difference between cruelty and none cruelty. Even at the time of Rousseau and his followers, the two concepts of total freedom and of everything, including man, being part of one big machine, could no longer be kept together. Rousseau's position of man's total freedom collides with a position that on the basis of man's reason alone, everything, including man, is part of one big machine. The two positions just couldn't be kept united. Later, the German philosophers Immanuel Kant and George Wilhelm Hegel and the Danish Søren Kierkegaard wrestled with the problem of a unity of reason on one hand, and on the other hand, meaning and values. But they did not solve the problem. Humanistic man, beginning only from himself, has concluded that he is only a machine. Humanistic man has no place for a personal God, but there is also no place for man's significance as man, no place for love, no place for freedom. Man is only a machine, but the men who hold this position could not and cannot live like machines. If they could, modern man would not have his tensions, either in his intellectual position or in his life. But he can't. And so they must leap away from reason to try to find something which gives meaning to their lives, to life itself, even though to do so, they deny their reason. Once this is done, any type of thing could be put there. Because in the area of non-reason, reason gives no basis for a choice. This is the hallmark of modern man. How did it happen? It happened because proud, humanistic man, though he was finite, insisted in beginning only from himself and from what he could learn without other knowledge. He did not succeed. Perhaps the best known of the existential philosophers was John Paul Sartre. He used to spend much time here in Paris at the Durmago. His position is that in the area of reason, everything is absurd, but that one can authenticate himself, that is, give validity to his existence by an act of the will. With Sartre's position, one can equally help an old woman across the street.
Merci, monsieur. Enfin, vous savez toujours, hein? Merci, monsieur. Merci beaucoup.
Or run her down. Reason was not involved, and there was nothing to show the direction that this authentication by an act of the will should take. But Sartre himself could not live consistently with his own position.
Adressé au président du tribunal international sur les crimes de guerre par le président Osimhen.
At a certain point, he signed the Algerian Manifesto, which declared that the Algerian War was a dirty war. This action meant man could use his reason to decide some things were right and some things were wrong, and so he destroyed his own system.
Au moment où les impérialistes américains intensifient à outrance l'escalade.
Karl Jasper's German existentialists tended to have the greatest impact on the thought and life form which followed existential thought. According to him, we may have some huge experience, which gives us the hope that perhaps there is a meaning to life, even though our reason tells us that life is absurd. He calls this a final experience. Martin Heidegger was another existential philosopher who said that the answer was in the area of non-reason. The German philosopher said there is something he called angst, a general feeling of anxiety one feels in the universe. This feeling, this mood of anxiety, revealed existence, and this imposes on us a call for decision. Out of this mood comes meaning to life and to choice, even against one's reason. Meaning which rests on nothing more than this vague feeling of anxiety, so nebulous it doesn't even have a specific object. As Martin Heidegger grew older, this view became too weak for him, so he changed his position. Existentialism as a form of philosophy has all but disappeared, but more and more people are thinking this way, even if they do not know the name existentialism. To them, reason leads to pessimism, and so they try to find an answer in something totally separated from reason. Aldous Huxley, the English philosopher and writer, proposed drugs as a solution. According to him, we should give drugs to healthy people. By means of the drug experience, they could then find truth inside their own heads anytime they wished. What was left for Huxley and his followers was truth inside man's own head. To them, objective truth was God. The drug culture and the mentality that went with it had its own vehicle which crossed the frontiers of the world, which were otherwise almost impassable by other means of communication. This record became the rallying cry of many of the young people throughout the whole world. It expressed the essence of their lives, their thoughts, and their feelings. Later came psychedelic rock, an attempt to find this experience without drugs. The younger people and the older ones tried drug taking, but then turned to the Eastern religions. Both drugs and the Eastern religions seek truth inside one's own head, in negation of reason. The central reason for the popularity of Eastern religions in the West is a hope for non-rational meaning to life and values. The reason young people turn to the Eastern religions and so on is simply the fact, as we have said, and that is that man having moved into the area of non-reason, you can put anything up there. And the heart of the Eastern religion is a denial of reason, just exactly as the idealistic drug taking was. And so the turning to the Eastern religions today fits exactly into the modern existential methodology, the existential thinking of modern men, of trying to find some optimistic hope in the area of non-reason when he's given up hope on a humanistic basis of finding any kind of unifying answer to life, any meaning to life in the answer of reason. Though demons do not fit into modern man's conclusions on the basis of his reason, many modern people feel that even demons are better than everything in the universe, being only one big machine. People put the occult in the area of non-reason, in the hope of some kind of meaning, even if it is a horrendous kind of meaning. One must feel as a Christian a real sorrow for these people. But as far as the blame is concerned, we must understand these people who have turned to this are not to blame. They must bear their own kind of blame of individual choices. But basically they're not to blame. The church is to blame, because the church with its liberal theology has left a vacuum. Man, beginning from himself alone, was now expressed and taught in theology and in theological language. In the Renaissance, men had attempted to mix Aristotle and Plato with Christianity. This new theology was an attempt to combine the rationalism of the Enlightenment with Christianity. It is often called religious liberalism. It was embarrassed by the supernatural and often denied it entirely. For example, the resurrection of Christ from the dead, that had tried to hold on to a historical Jesus by sifting out from the New Testament all those supernatural elements which the New Testament taught about Jesus. This attempt came to a climax with Albert Schweitzer's famous book, Quest of the Historical Jesus. It failed. It failed to read the New Testament account of the supernatural and still keep an historic Christ. The historic Jesus could not be separated from the supernatural events connected with him in the New Testament. History and the supernatural are too interwoven in the New Testament. If one kept any of the historical Jesus, one had to keep some of the supernatural. If one got rid of all the supernatural, one had no historical Jesus. We should remember Schweitzer's humanitarianism in Africa, his genius as an organist, and his expertise concerning Bach. But unhappily, we must remember his place in the theological stream as well. After the failure of the older theological liberalism, Karl Barth stepped into the vacuum. He held the higher critical views concerning the Bible. That is, that the Bible has many mistakes. But he taught that a religious word could break through from it. This was the theological form of existentialism after existentialism had been accepted in its secular form. Thus, one more thing was added to the area of non-reason, along with all the other things that had been put there. In another way, we must have admiration for the Swiss Karl Barth, because while he was teaching in Germany, he spoke out clearly against Nazism in his Barmen Declaration of 1934. The teaching of Barth led to those theologians who said that the Bible isn't true in the areas of science and history, but they nevertheless looked for a religious experience from it. And for many adherents of this theology, the Bible does not give absolutes in regard to what is right or wrong, either. Before you even come to the Bible and begin to read it, one must realize there are two ways to read the Bible. One is just one more religious thing among thousands of other religious things, which really are nothing more than another form of trip, not very, very different actually from a drug trip. The other way is to understand that the Bible is truth. And as such, what we're listening to is something that is completely contrary to what we hear about us on every side, namely merely statistical averages, relativistic things. Now, having said this, then I'd have to guard myself for the simple reason that it doesn't mean a person has to believe all this before he can begin to read the Bible and find truth in the Bible. I'll just say in passing, I was not raised in a Christian family, and I was reading much philosophy when I was a young man, and I didn't read the Bible because I believed it was true. I read it just simply out of an intellectual honesty. But I did do one thing. I read it exactly the way it was written. Beginning with Genesis 1:1 and going right on, I read it the same way I would read another book, expecting that what was being given was a straightforward statement of what was meant, and that it wasn't to be read in a different level than I would read in the area of another kind of book. And as I read it, it answered the questions which already by that time I realized that humanistic philosophy couldn't answer. And over a 6 month period, I came to conclude that it was truth. But nevertheless, we must keep in the back of our mind, how are we reading the Bible? Just as another religious trip? Or am I really wrestling with the question of what is given in all the areas of which it speaks? Is this truth and compared to merely relativism? The new liberal theologian has no answer for the existence of evil, and thus they're left with the same problem as the Hindu philosophers. Everything that is a part of God. This is Kali, the Eastern Hindu feminine representation of God. Why the fangs and the skulls? In Eastern religious thought, cruelty is ultimately the same as non-cruelty. Because everything that now is part of that which has always been, a part of what they call God. Modern humanistic man has come to the same awful place, a place in which it is not possible to know what is right and what is wrong, nor why we should choose non-cruelty rather than cruelty. Professor Paul Tillich of Harvard was one of the outstanding neo-Orthodox liberal theologians. A student who was present told me that when Professor Tillich was lecturing in Santa Barbara just before his death, someone said to him, "Sir, do you pray?" And he said, "No, but I meditate." He was left only with the word God, with no certainty that there was anything more than just a word. The God is dead theologians, which followed Tillich, concluded logically that if they are only left with the word God, they might as well cross out the word. But for these theologians, even if they do not say God is dead, for them certain things are dead. All content about God is dead, and all assurance of knowledge about a personal God is dead. Because for them, God has not given to people truth about himself in the Bible and in the revelation in Christ. That is, truth about himself which may be expressed in propositions in normal language. All they're left with is religious words without content, but with that emotion that certain religious words still brings with them, and that is all. And here is what comes next. These highly motivational religious words out of our religious past, but separated from the content which the Bible originally gave them, are now used for manipulation. Manipulation in such areas as a change in sexual ethic, but also legal and political manipulation. If God is dead, if content about God is dead, if the knowledge of a personal God who has not been silent but has given us truth is dead, then everything for which God gives an answer and meaning is dead as well. And yet, people, no matter who they say they are, cry out for meaning and values. And this place of tension is where modern man has come upon his humanist base. And this is where he is. When we think of Christ, of course we think of his substitutionary death upon the cross. When he who claimed to be God died in a substitutionary way. And as such, his death had infinite value. And as we accept that gift, raising the empty hands of faith and accepting it with no humanistic elements, we have that which is real life, and that is in being in relationship to the infinite personal God who is there, and being in personal relationship to it. But Christ brings life in another way that often is not as clearly thought about, perhaps, and that is that he connects himself with what the Bible teaches in his teaching. And as such, he is a prophet as well as a savior. And it's upon the basis of what he taught and the Bible teaches, because he himself wraps these together, that we have life instead of death, in the sense of having some knowledge that is more than man can have from himself, beginning from himself alone. Both of these elements are the place where Christ gives us life.
Okay, let me get the lights back on and talk to you about this a little bit. So just briefly to summarize his arguments, because he just threw a ton at you, didn't he? That was a lot. A lot. He starts off with this notion that people down through the ages were optimistic that you could come up with a theory of reality that was unified, right? And each generation says, no, he doesn't have it right, I have it right. And the next generation says, no, he doesn't have it right, I have it right. So there's this idea that you can have a unified theory of reality until you get to the modern era where they're like, no, the whole project is impossible. There is no meaning. Okay? And then what happens, according to the way I'm hearing this, is that some people try to embrace the absurd, realizing that suicide is logical if there is no meaning. Most people don't want to do that. They don't want to kill themselves. And so what they try to do is they separate their theory of reality into like a top floor and a bottom floor. So you have the bottom floor being the area of facts. He's talking about the area of reason. Okay? Reason. And the top story is where there's meaning. There's value. Okay? But the area, the bottom floor of reason can't deliver to us any kind of assurance or certainty that we can arrive at solid answers to questions about meaning. And so in this top floor, bottom floor thing, we try to fill this space with all kinds of stuff. And they took us on a tour of what 20th century people are trying to fill that non-reason area, because humans need hope. They need meaning. They need value. They need to be able to live in societies with laws, etc. They need art, music, etc. So this dichotomy between reason and not reason, we try to fill this with stuff. So can you guys think through the film real quick and try to remember some things that he mentioned that we try to fill? Drugs, right? So drugs is tried out as an ideology, really. What else?
Drugs, sex, and rock and roll.
Drugs, sex, and rock and roll.
Meatloaf.
What else? He also included the occult, didn't he?
Eastern religions.
Eastern religions. So, and then what he tries to do in this film, and he gets remember this is 1 of 10, he tries to bring Jesus in. The art gets better, the music gets better, and he lingers on that painting for a long time as he's kind of panning around and saying, I got something better for you, why don't you try this out? Right, and put that out there for you as a way to integrate reason and non-reason. Oh, the other thing that he put up here in this area is an errant Bible, right? So he's taking a shot at liberal theologians in the neo-Orthodox tradition too. Because he's going to argue for a unified theory of reality that is integrated through the Christian tradition, right? That's what he's trying to put forward to people to get these things back together. Seems like I wanted to say something else about that before I open the floor for comments and questions. In the next one, he's going to talk about how these ideas, even though most of us have not heard about these philosophers and haven't read the existentialists and all of these people, that you can see it reflected in our society and in our art form. So he's going to go in the next one, take you on a tour and say, this is art from the Renaissance. This is art now. Can you see the differences about how meaning is portrayed in these types of things? He plays classical music and then he plays postmodern music where people are just kind of making noises and compares those two things. So maybe next week we'll look at that a little bit. But one of his consistent critiques, and you can even see him doing this in the video, is to show how all of these are dead ends, and how they all, you think that they'll deliver meaning and purpose, but they don't, they fail. And so people just keep trying to grab onto something else. And he likes to show how their own philosophies break on the rocks of reality, right? And show that, well, he tried to embrace the absurd, but here we have him making a very important speech about how we really need to take care of those people in that other country. So he's still making meaning and values statements even though he just said everything was absurd. So just a quick kind of overview. We do have some time to discuss the ideas tonight, but my goals tonight were really to take this film to introduce you to some of what it would be like to be there. What are they talking about? They're talking about art. They're talking about theology. They're talking about intellectual history to try to help people with hard problems. Now, what you've experienced now is a very compressed condensation of his thought. You would, if you were at L'Abri, it wouldn't take 20 minutes. You would be there for maybe the whole summer, or 3 weeks, or at least a weekend, where it wouldn't be so drinking out of the fire hose like that. But you can also see, if he's fairly conversant with some of these ideas, how you go to a place like Harvard and get an ovation at Harvard because he sounds like he knows what he's talking about. Now, he has been criticized on some of the way he's presenting this material, how he's even understanding some of these philosophers, and it's a little bit beyond my scope to talk about that tonight. But if you want some of that, we can do some of that too. But go ahead and raise your hand and comment or ask a question about where we are so far.
I remember when I first started to read Schaeffer. I was a college student at IU in Bloomington, which was one of the most pagan places in the Midwest. Okay? Maybe you didn't quite get to where California was, but it was that close.
What year was this, Steve?
71 through 76.
Okay, that's helpful. 71 to 76.
So
Okay.
Early 70s.
Okay.
I was there then. Yeah, Schaeffer's books were new. Okay, but he had taken this stuff and he had written it down. And he had, like, the book that came out of his lecture series at Wheaton. And as Christians in a pagan campus, we were trying to figure out how to deal with what he's talking about there. And he explained it so well that it fit what we were dealing with. Because we were trying to deal with the Eastern religions and the drug use and the psychedelic music, and all those things were going on around us. And here's this little enclave of Christian students who felt like we were a very tiny minority, trying to figure out, how do we talk to people about this? How do we deal with this? And Schaeffer explained it in a way that we could do that. So it was really important for that particular topic.
Well said, Steve. Thank you so much for your testimony. Beautiful. Brian.
Who is the modern day Schaeffer, Dan? Or has Christianity at this point, to Steve's point, have we thrown our hands up and said that these discussions are inaccessible and that there are groups that we can no longer reach? Who is the intellectual? Who is the thought leader currently? Because there's lots of guys writing books. I mean, you can get online and see lots of them. But who's having and addressing these conversations in this deep level today?
Great question. So Brian's asking, who's a modern day Schaeffer? And my answer to this is that there's an army of them. There really isn't a singular person. His disciples went and got PhDs, and they chaired faculties and were on faculties all over the world, right? And so the heritage of this notion of a unified theory of truth that is robustly Christian is in a lot of our institutions. I'll say, if you do want some names of prominent ones that are sort of Schaefferian, Os Guinness is going to float up to the top pretty soon. Nancy Pearcey, I don't know if you've heard that name. She keeps popping up as someone who's able to speak to us from this, and really at all levels. So remember, Francis Schaeffer started, he got his international, beginnings of his international ministry in children's ministry, right? So this guy is flying at this altitude. He can fly higher than that, but he can also talk to kids. So there's a rare giftedness that's able to like do all the cookies on all the shelves, right? And so who are the ones that are doing that kind of work today? Oz Guinness, Nancy Piercy. I would even talk about Timothy Keller as someone who's really good at, in an accessible way, saying, you guys think that secularism is going to deliver the society and the life that you want. Let me show you how it's actually a dead end. And so he'll do this, a similar apologetic tactic where you show how secular life doesn't lead to the kind of flourishing that you think that it does, and that Christianity isn't just a backwood religion full of haters. It actually has viable answers to the deep questions that we all have when we're really honest in the middle of the night when we're awake and we're wrestling with our own existence. So, thank you. Great question. Yes,
Take
Mark
it
Osborne.
further.
Yes.
You're saying Francis Schaeffer has taught many others, and don't leave it with them. It has dribbled down to our pastors,
Of course.
to our Sunday school teachers, to
Yep.
our different biologists, historians. Look what you're doing now.
That's
Look
exactly
what-
right.
How Mark teaches.
That's exactly right.
Um,
Well said. So, we're probably all only 1 degree removed from Francis Schaeffer. It would be surprising if there's somebody in this room who doesn't know somebody who knew him. That's how close he is and how massive his influence is. One of my theology teachers, to your point, at Dallas Seminary, was at L'Abri for a while. He was. Same with Brighton Albright at Covenant. I don't know what your situation was at Trinity, but there's got to be somebody at Trinity that was at L'Abri. So he's a close personal friend to Jay Kessler. Jay Kessler is a good friend. And if you know Jay, you're that close, right? So go ahead.
There's
Paul.
a lady who's written a book, Jesus Calling, Sarah Young, a daily devotional book. Beautiful. And she was a rebel. And her parents sent her off to France, to L'Abri, to spend the summer. Revolutionized her life.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. Any other comments or questions?
By the way,
Right. Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Did he have an earned degree?
He had an earned master's degree.
They called him Dr. Schaeffer.
They did. He had a bunch of honorary doctorates. I don't believe he had an earned doctorate. Somebody correct me on that if I'm wrong. I don't think there's an earned doctorate. Rob.
Not sure how to articulate this, but let's say you had a modern day Schaeffer. Also, I think another modern Carl Truman, I think, touches on similarly on many of these issues at this point. But how would they be accepted, or would they be accepted on a secular campus like Schaeffer, like they would embrace Schaeffer, seeking, hey, here's some different ideas, here's possible answers to, whatever. But would an IU or a Harvard, or would they even have these people on campus unless they were invited by some, university group or something? How would they be? How would they be welcomed?
Well, how would they be welcomed if there was an apologist like this at a modern secular campus? I'm sure that's really dependent on which school, where, but if anybody would want to, Steve, you want to comment on what you think? I'm actually not very well positioned to know that. Mark?
When I worked for Probe Ministries in Dallas, Texas, there were a dozen professors, a couple of women judges, who together in groups visited 73 to 76, 75 state universities by invitation into 50 classrooms a week, 150 classrooms a week, then an evening speaker. usually somebody like Josh McDowell speaking on prophecy or something like that, that openness closed about the middle 80s. And I can't tell you why. I left Probe in 76. There was an openness there, and it was more of a, hey, we're honest. We can look at anything. And I think the wisdom of the Christian worldview and the ability to defend it and the winsomeness with which it was presented, not angry from a pulpit, students liking it. We had Christian retreats at the end of the week, a weekend, with 200, 250 kids who were Christians who wanted that reinforcement that there were academic supporters for their point of view. And then they can continue the discussion. It was pre-evangelism, put on by invitation, Christians and Christian groups like Campus Crusade telling their professors, getting invited, approved by the university because of the use of campus buildings. And then that closed. It's not open now. And publishing seemed to take more of the point of view then.
There are. Thank you, Mark. Excellent answer. There are some positive things happening. I just don't know the scope, right? So, if you've heard of Rebecca McLaughlin, is another name that is important. She's interfacing with really secular groups. I don't know exactly where or how, but there are apologist ministries that I don't know if they're invited by Campus Life or whatever, not into the classroom perhaps, but are around. So, great discussion. We are at the end of our time, so let me pray, and hopefully I'll see you Sunday or next week. Father, we thank you so much for your goodness to us and the heritage that we've received to have purpose and meaning. And just remember my own grandfather, how important the question of purpose and meaning was to his own conversion. We have to have purpose and meaning. So we thank you for giving us purpose and meaning. We pray, Lord, that you would help us to be faithful to the task this week, whatever we face, to continue to offer the hope to our families and the people around us. We thank you. You're so good. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, guys.